Welcome to episode 63 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. I'm Cadden Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tacek.
Last week we talked about talking to your folks about security. This week we're going to push them out of the way and look at their computers ourselves. Now hopefully you will be doing this with their permission. In fact, hopefully you won't be able to do this without their permission, because their computer or other devices will be password protected with strong passwords that you won't be able to guess quickly or easily. A guy can dream. Items we're looking at on this week's list: check the basics, a web browser checkup, we're going to talk about installing security software, we're going to lock down their Wi-Fi and Internet of Things, and finally, maybe you should consider setting up remote access so you can check it when you're not around. But let's start with the basics by checking the basics. What are we looking for, guys?
Well, let's definitely start by checking the basics, but I kind of enjoy helping out my parents during the holidays.
You enjoy that?
I do. I enjoy it. It's a different conversation piece, and you get to avoid other conversations, and, you know, you could be antisocial, lock yourself away in a room, and, you know, the way it all started in the beginning for us.
Indeed.
Well, all right, so let's check the basics. We need to ask if there's anything specific that they're having issues with, or if they have any questions. This could be a good way to start zeroing in on areas of focus if your time is limited between dessert and everything else. You want to make sure there's enough free hard drive space, RAM, and that the computer has been rebooted recently. A lot of times, people will leave their computers on for, I don't know, just to keep the longest uptime. And the only time they're ever rebooted is when the house has a power surge. Many times, a slow computer isn't caused by anything more complex than running out of hard drive space or running too many apps with too little RAM. You want to make sure that outside of the computer is free of excessive dust and that the vents aren't being blocked by anything. You know, make sure that there's not a blanket warming the computer. We've seen a lot of crazy stuff when people have contacted us.
Oh, no, I've seen it in my family. My mother-in-law, their computer, it was a PC, was running real slow. I mean, like, this thing, the fans were running. It sounded like it was trying to take off into outer space. And it was super sluggish. It turns out she had, like, a box of arts and crafts stuff on the vent on top of the PC, completely blocking it. And the side vents it was kind of pushed in between two shelves, so it had no room to breathe, essentially. And it was clogged with dust. But the minute I took the arts and crafts box off the top of it, the fan stopped running nonstop, and the computer started running faster. And I was like, okay, leave that off. And a couple weeks later, it was right back on top of the computer. But one other thing to point out, as long as I've interrupted you here, is regarding hard drive space. Apple actually recommends keeping at least 10% of the maximum size of your, like, the disk size for your hard drive. They recommend keeping at least 10% of that free at any given time. So if you have a 500 gigabyte hard drive in your computer, you'd want to be keeping 50 gigabytes free at any given time. And that gives the computer room to, if it needs to swap out, if memory runs out on the computer, it swaps out with some extra temporary space on the temporary files on the computer, that kind of stuff. And that gives it enough room to do its thing without running out of space.
Let me ask you a question, though, because I'll be honest with you, that's not even something that I think about very often, and my entire work life is centered around my computer. I mean, is there a way to sort of guide your friends, family members, distant relatives, whatever, on how to keep that stuff lean? Or is there just like, do you have to actually take them and show them, okay, well, this is where this is telling you how much you have left, so just take some stuff off?
Yeah, it kind of depends. I believe newer versions of Mac OS can kind of clean up some of that stuff automatically.
Yes.
but older versions don't. It's pretty easy to figure out how much space you have, though. You just go to the Apple menu in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, click About This Mac, and then on the screen that pops up, there's you can click Storage. It will actually show you your hard drive and what is taken up by what on the computer, so it'll list movies or apps. So you can see, oh, look, movies are taking up 75% of my hard drive space. Maybe I should delete a few of those movies. And there are apps that can help you with that, too. But for the most part,
I'm thinking more though about the kind of thing like you just mentioned. Actually, Apple has gotten pretty good about if you've got an iCloud account, then what it's doing a lot of times is it's taking stuff and just shooting it up to the cloud. Still available, sort of. It's leaving placeholders on your Mac. So then, if you need a file again, you can go ahead and click it and re-download the file. Chances are, if your parents are like my parents, they're just a bunch of files they're never actually going to access again, but they don't want to throw them away either. So having it set up to sort of automatically shoot stuff up to iCloud might not be the worst thing in the world. Because then they can look and see, oh, good, I've still got that, even though I don't need it, and they won't.
Yeah, and like checking the download folder for leftover installers, stuff like that, those can end up taking up quite a bit of space when they, accidentally download 5 copies of a game or something like that.
You mentioned the storage tab, and on the more recent versions of OS X, in that storage tab, you could actually click, there's a manage button, and from there, you could see all those different options. So you could optimize your mail storage. I can right now free up 14.93 gigs if I were to clean that up a little bit.
Wow. So you're not the poster child for Inbox Zero, I'm guessing.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
Oh, I know.
Oh, and magnets. We were talking about what you run into, or what we've run into for support issues. I remember early on in the day of doing tech support when I worked for an ISP. We couldn't figure out what was wrong with this person's computer. So we had them bring their computer down. And they brought their computer down. It had a plethora of magnets on the case.
Yeah.
It was a nice collection of magnets.
Yeah. Late 1990s, I was walking through my office one time and I passed by a friend's desk and she had used a magnet to put a picture of, I think it was like her and her kid or her and her boyfriend or something. I don't remember what the picture was. But there was a picture, like magnet, like right on her computer. And I was just like, yeah, can I have this, please? Okay, mine now. Okay. Yeah.
Well, the next thing on our list is to make sure the operating system and apps are up to date. You want to download and install the latest versions. A lot of times, the latest versions will include security fixes. So not only are you running up-to-date software, but you're being protected against the latest threats as well. So that's another good one to make sure of. And it could fix all different bugs or issues that they're running into along the way. So definitely one of the top items on the list. And then make sure that they have some sort of backup system in place. Local backup options would include a time capsule or other external backup drive. Remote backup options would include iCloud backup. And you want to explain the differences between the two to your parents. Local backups could be lost in an event of a fire or natural disaster. So unless you're physically taking backups off-site on a regular basis, it might not be enough. And you want to be sure that Time Machine or whatever equivalent you're using is enabled and actually making backups of the important files. If you're seeing messages saying that the backup is full and it's not overwriting old backups, then that could be an issue there because, well, whenever it stopped backing up could be your last actually good backup there.
And backups are especially important when you're talking about, your parents or somebody who's less technically savvy, because a lot of times, like if they're running out of hard drive space and you've, said, hey, make sure you have some free hard drive space on your computer. They might just dump all of their photos to free up some space, not understanding that, if they don't have a backup, if they're not in iCloud or whatever, those photos are then gone. or if they try and fix a problem on their computer. We've seen that happen way too often, where well-intentioned people will accidentally delete critical files and render their computer unbootable or inaccessible in other means. So having a way to kind of fix the problem in a relatively quick manner is really important when you don't want your parents to lose all the family photos or anything like that. So
the next thing we're going to check is we're going to do a web browser checkup. And this is kind of a weird one to me, except that the more I think about it, there's so much of what our parents do, or what, some of our relatives do, that is just web-based. If their computer is not working, I mean, they may come to you even and say, my computer is not working, but it might not even be the computer. It might just be that one window through which they appear. Talk to me about what we're looking for here.
Yeah, well, if you're, like us, you most likely have a few extensions installed in your web browser. You probably have a password manager. You might have an ad blocker. You kind of keep them to the minimum, but functional and secure. Your parents, on the other hand, might have the top third of the screen is filled up with toolbars when they open their web browser. Or, those shopping helper extensions that aren't really shopping helpers, but just display a bunch of ads. Stuff like that. You want to make sure that their web browsers are kind of up to date and clean and everything else. So the first thing is obviously make sure they're running the latest version. Check for updates. Enable automatic updates if the browser supports it, because then you don't have to worry about checking for that again in the future. You do want to check for bad web browser extensions and add-ons. Uninstall them if you find them. And if need be, you want to explain to your parents in the nicest way possible that they don't need to click on everything. They don't need to download every single thing that something pops up on the web. You don't need to download it if it says, hey, download this. You probably want to install a reputable ad blocker or Safari content blocker to take care of some of those malicious ads. If you're running a browser that allows Flash or Silverlight or one of those other media type extensions or add-ons, you want to make sure that those are up to date. Some browsers it's not necessary with, like Google Chrome automatically has its own version of Flash that it updates when Google Chrome updates, and you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. But another thing would be like what you're saying before, kind of about how if the web browser is not working correctly, that sometimes people think the entire computer is broken. If you're encountering a situation where the person says, "Oh, my web browser won't let me do anything else; it's stuck on this one web page," and that's a pretty typical scam that we've seen in the past few years here, which is one of those pop-ups that essentially locks your web browser and says you have to call this number in order to have them download and fix it and pay them $400 to fix it. And all that's really happening is it's a script running from usually an ad on the website in the background that has locked up the browser to that one pop-up box. And when you click OK to close the pop-up, another one opens. And there's been a bit of a cat and mouse game with the major browser vendors where after closing a pop-up, the next pop-up that pops up, they'll give you a little checkbox saying don't show pop-ups again for this site. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't with these typical scams. But in Safari, for example, all you have to do is force quit Safari and then hold down the Shift key on your keyboard and relaunch Safari, and it will reopen it in safe mode, which means it's not reopening the previous web pages. It's essentially not going to go back to that scam site that locked up the computer in the first place. And that might be one, if you encounter that problem with your parents, to show them that trick in Safari is to hold down the Shift key, because that makes it pretty easy for them to get themselves out of that mess in the future if they encounter it again. You don't want them getting scammed by these tech support scammers who are, essentially just trying to steal their money.
But they're not going to call tech support. They're going to call you
Hopefully,
first.
That's one situation where you really hope they do, because you don't want them calling the fake tech support numbers we've discussed previously on the show.
Next thing we're going to do, and this one is, I would imagine, what we're going to do now is we're going to install security software on their computer. And I'm guessing, too, we're going to make sure that there's nothing that's calling itself security software already installed. Because I could see, you just mentioned a scam a moment ago where somebody calls someplace and they unlock something. I would imagine that there are some downloads that supposedly are security software that aren't really, but then we're going to talk about putting a reputable one on there as well, correct? I'm sorry, I just threw like 3 questions into one question and put it out there. Let's start first with installing the security software.
Sure. Well, you want to make sure that there's some sort of anti-malware software installed on their computer. And you want to make sure that it's a reputable one, not one that your parents may have been scared to install from some sort of scam pop-up type deal.
Ken, what you said about sometimes some of the security software you find on there might be something you don't want to find. There are plenty of scam security software options available, especially if you have a parent who doesn't necessarily know what they're doing and they just type something in Google or they see a pop-up and download whatever. So the first thing to do is make sure that they have reputable security software installed from a well-known company that's not essentially scamming people. If you find that they don't have any security software whatsoever, go ahead and install some reputable security software. We actually have our own products. MaxScan is our anti-malware product, and PrivacyScan is our privacy and security product. Those are two options that you would want to consider. We have free demos available for those as well. Most of the major vendors also have free trial versions. So if you're already using security software yourself that you know and trust, go ahead and maybe download a demo of that. If they do have reputable security software already installed, make sure it's up to date and that the subscription's active, and let them know that most reputable software does require a subscription, so it might be costing them a bit of money to get things secure on their computer. If they are running something that is questionable security software, see if your reputable security software picks it up. It should be able to remove it and take care of the problem there. If it doesn't, there are options available. You can usually contact any reputable security vendor, actually, and they can help you take care of the scam stuff to get that off the computer. But just running a scan with reputable software, make sure nothing nasty is lurking on the computer, clean up anything that's detected. The scans can take a while. And actually, we didn't mention it earlier, but when you're installing those operating system updates and app updates, that can also take a while. So you might want to time that for when the turkey's in the oven or something like that. Just know that it might take a while where you're not going to be able to really use the computer. So if you have other stuff you need to be doing or helping out with around the house, that would be a good time to go ahead and do that kind of stuff. And then finally, you want to make sure that the security software is set up to run a scan on a regular basis, especially if your folks are forgetful. You don't want it to be that the security scans are only being run when you're visiting for the holidays. In addition to security software, it's a good idea to make sure that they have a password management app. We've hit on this in a number of episodes in the past. There are commercial options like 1Password that are really great, well worth the cost. Also, built-in iCloud Keychain has improved a lot over the past year or so, and it is now an excellent free alternative. In the past, we've kind of been on the fence about it, but Apple really has made some leaps and bounds with regards to iCloud Keychain, so it's definitely something we recommend at this point.
And if they say, no, I don't need a password management app, I know my password. Your password?
Singular, yes, password.
Your singular.
Right.
Your singular password. You need to start using more than one password.
This is how much we talk about password issues. I know without looking, although I did just double check, it's number 8. Password do's and don'ts is an episode of the checklist that we did quite a while ago. Back in the first, I guess, second or third week we were doing the show. Number 8 is password do's and don'ts. Next on the list takes us to episode number 42, I believe it is, of the checklist, the one about Internet of Things. We're going to talk, though, not about the Internet of Things specifically, but making sure that we've locked down Wi-Fi and Internet of Things devices. And when I say we have, I mean, whoever it is that needs that done.
Well, this could be a bit more tricky, and you should only mess around with these settings if you know what you're doing. Instructions on securing Wi-Fi routers and IoT devices can vary from device to device. So when in doubt, it's best to read the user manual for the devices that you're dealing with. If your parents still don't have the manuals for them, almost all of them are available online, so you should be good there. But they're in a drawer somewhere, so you could find the original one.
I was going to say it's right under the pictures of you in the 5th grade.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
With the toaster oven manual and everything else. Okay, so you're going to want to make sure that the Wi-Fi network is secured with strong encryption. It's okay to write the Wi-Fi password down on a sticky note for your folks to keep next to their computer. if they have an older Wi-Fi router that's only capable of WEP for the security option, it's probably time for them to invest in a new router.
I'll jump in real quick here. One thing to note is that a lot of times the ISPs will have either a custom firmware for the router or a specific model for the router that will work with their network. So you can't necessarily just hop out to the store and buy a brand new router if the ISP router that they have is a combo. If it's what the internet actually comes in on, if it's acting as the modem and the router, you need to possibly contact your parents' ISP to see if an upgraded device is available. A lot of times, if you've been with the same ISP for a decade or whatever, they don't go out of their way to give you new hardware unless the current hardware breaks. But if you find that this router is like so ancient that it can't do any modern security stuff, you can probably call up the ISP. They might charge you for a new router, but you could at least find out if there's an option available there. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that was...
No, that was totally hitting home here because I just made that call. And they're like, so we have this new hardware available, but because yours isn't quote-unquote broken, we're going to have to charge you an install fee. And I'm like, no, I could install it myself. Just send me the hardware. Oh, no, that's not the way it works for them. But on to other things. Let's see. So we talked about Wi-Fi network is secured with strong encryption. Now, the wireless network name, or the SSID, you don't necessarily need to hide that. This only makes it harder for legitimate users to get on the Wi-Fi network and does nothing to deter actual attackers.
Forgive me, I'm not sure what you mean. How do you hide the network name?
In a lot of Wi-Fi routers, there's an option to essentially not broadcast the network name. That's when you're connecting an airport. You can specify, join other network, and you have to enter the network name and the password for the network.
Oh.
And that it wouldn't appear on your list of airport networks, but you could see it with any sort of, if you have any sort of Wi-Fi hardware device or a special app that can actually essentially look for Wi-Fi networks that are hidden. The bad guys have those apps. It's not, you're just making it hard for your parents and their friends to get on the Wi-Fi network if you try and hide the network name. It really is not. It used to be a recommendation for security. Oh, hide your Wi-Fi network so the bad guys don't know it's there. And it doesn't do anything. It just makes it more annoying.
Plus, it takes away a creative outlet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like the people
what do you name your network name, Ken?
Well, different things, different times. Depends on what mood I'm in. A lot of times it's pop culture stuff, but I love when people have things like, FBI surveillance ban.
Exactly.
That's always a fun one.
I was just about to say that. That was a great one.
And then one of my favorites actually is Wu-Tang Clan, but with a lock on it. And if you know it's Wu-Tang Clan, then you know why. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, so what do you name yours, Nick? Oh, don't tell me, because that's probably going to let somebody into something that they shouldn't know about you.
Oh, no, I just used the default name, so nobody will ever bother to care about mine, right?
That's so boring.
One other thing to check while you're in there with the Wi-Fi settings actually is the channel that the Wi-Fi router is on. If your parents are living in an area with, like, if they're in a big city, if they're downtown, or if they've got a lot of neighbors with Wi-Fi devices, sometimes Wi-Fi can slow down if there's too many devices on the same network, and sometimes stuff like your microwave can actually interfere with it depending on what wavelength it's running on. So you might want to change, or if possible, set the router to auto choose the channel it's going to operate on. But sometimes if you're encountering slow Wi-Fi speeds and it's not the speed of the router itself, changing to a different Wi-Fi channel can sometimes solve the problem. So that might be something to check into as well.
So we talked about locking down the Wi-Fi. Talk to me now about those IoT things.
All those things. Yeah, that's an important one. One of the biggest things is keeping up to date with the firmware on all those devices. Many of the recent DDoS attacks that have been in the news lately were powered by insecure IoT devices. So you want to make sure any IoT device on your parents' home network, such as security cameras, smart TVs, those smart light bulbs, those picture frames that connect remotely and broadcast the latest feed of pictures. You want to make sure that they are all running the latest firmware. And another big thing is changing the default passwords to be something more secure. Many routers and IoT devices have default usernames and passwords these days. And those allow an attacker to gain easy access. So whenever possible, try to move away from the default login information, but be sure to write down those usernames and passwords for your parents. It's not likely that they'll need to use them, but you'll want to keep them handy to avoid having to reset devices to factory defaults if you need to access them in the future.
And one thing that is important to note there is that when we're talking about default usernames and passwords, we're talking about things like the username is username and the password is password, or admin. A lot of newer Wi-Fi routers, at least, will have login information printed on the side of the router itself, but it's not like default across all the devices. It might have it'll have a login password, but it's going to be randomized for that device. And that's okay to leave in place. It makes it actually really easy for your parents if they would have to access the device, that they can just look on the side of it for the network password or whatever, or the system, the login password for the device. We're really talking about when there is no password, or when it really is set to something really silly like 1, 2, 3, 4. Those are the times we want to change it. I know when I'm talking about the router thing there, I know for a fact that 2-wire routers have that, and I believe there are other Wi-Fi routers out there that do the same thing, where it is a unique password for the device, but it is already preset on the device. So that's not something you have to worry about. You only have to worry about the IoT devices or routers that are really not secure out of the box.
Oh, that means you're not paranoid about that big database of the default usernames and passwords, or the algorithm together to generate those passwords based off the MAC addresses. I don't know. Change it all.
The thing that I was wondering about, actually, not to get stuck on it, but when you're talking about the Internet of Things, and you're saying, go to their manuals and make sure you've gone in and you've changed this information. I mean, if you buy knockoff devices, and I don't know, and I'm going to do the thing that I always do, where I'm going to knock Walgreens, and it's nothing against Walgreens, they're just the ones I can think of. There are all kinds of internet-connected things that you can buy at Walgreens, and all from brands you've never heard of. Not all. I mean, there might be some that are brands you've heard of, but a lot of them are like those picture frames that you were talking about a minute ago. Do they actually come with manuals? I mean, I guess they must come with manuals on how to do that, but like you said, update the firmware. I mean, if I'm buying a $10 or a $20 internet connected picture frame, do you think the firmware on that is really getting updated that often?
The one thing you can do, if it is like a generic that's based off of something else, sometimes you can search by the whatever brand name they've put on the picture frame, or on the little, serial number information on the bottom of it. Sometimes you can search by the model number, and if you're lucky on Google, there's somebody who says, oh yeah, that's running this and this operating system, here's the firmware. That one's, it's a little more tricky when it comes to those knockoff devices. If there's no possibility of you tracking down a firmware update for the device and you're really kind of unsure about it, that's just a situation where you want to make sure that the Wi-Fi router is set up with the firewall, that the network's password protected, essentially doing everything you can do to shield that IoT device from being accessed, without any other, without being directly physically connected to the network.
It's almost like sandboxing your house.
Exactly. Or, maybe ask your parents if they really, really, really care about that picture frame, if they really need it.
Yeah. If you have all your computers off and your router's still going crazy, transmitting so much data, see what happens when you turn off that picture frame.
That's crazy.
Or that security camera, or whatever it may be.
It's not crazy, but it's crazy, right? I mean, I was doing a story on Mac OS X recently, and I was just like, do you remember when you didn't need a security update for your watch? And you don't really think about that, right? I mean, the picture frames, it's like, oh, yes, turn off the picture frame, which is a phrase that would not have made sense to any of us 30 years ago.
One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of newer IoT devices that are brand name or from reputable companies, do take steps to keep them up to date with firmware and security updates. I know that with a Wi-Fi cam that I have, it had a little piece of paper in the box saying, go to this website and download this latest firmware before you do anything else. And they actually had full instructions on changing the default username and password to make sure that random people couldn't be using your webcam to spy on you remotely. Especially if your parents have, older devices or stuff that's been installed in their home systems for a while, and you might have fixed your stuff at your house, but keep in mind that there are other things. One thing that can actually be really beneficial when trying to track down what might be around their house without having to look through every single room and try and figure out what's connected to the internet is a lot of the Wi-Fi routers actually have a list of connected devices. It will tell you, sometimes it tells you, like my router at home is smart enough to know, oh, this is an IP camera. This is the Wi-Fi extender. This is whatever. So that's another place to look, is sometimes if your parents don't quite know what they have, you could actually look through that list when you're logged into the router, checking the security settings on that. You can actually see, oh, hey, look, there's a smart TV that's, on the network. And you can ask your parents, like, oh yeah, there's a smart TV in the guest room. We should probably take a look at that.
Yeah. I've got an app for my router that I'm looking at it right now. It's telling me everything that's connected. How many things are connected, what those devices actually are, if it's able to recognize what those devices are.
And you could probably force disconnect it too from there.
Yeah.
You think I should try it? No, because that might be my computer or, somebody else's something else. Hey, we got one more thing to hit before we go, because we're really talking about this as we're talking today. And these are all good things for when you're near your folks' computer. But then a lot of times you're going to be near your folks' computer once a year, maybe twice a year, maybe once every 2 years. And so you're not always going to be there to do this. And even if you're there to do it once a year, that's only once a year. One of the last things we're going to consider, if you have a family member who is sort of prone, I would say, to stumbling into trouble, you might want to consider setting up remote access so that when they have a problem in April, you don't say to them, well, I'll be out there in November. You might actually be able to get in to take a look. I guess the two things I'm wondering, guys, are, first of all, when would you want to do this? And then what are some of the steps that we would think about going about it?
Well, I've done tech support in the past, and I know Nick has as well, and anybody else who's ever done tech support understands that sometimes the telephone is not the best way to help somebody out when they're having a computer problem. Yeah. When you can't see the screen, if you're trying to tell them where to click and they don't understand the difference between single clicking and double clicking or any stuff, it can really be a nightmare for everybody involved. And also, this is an option if you're being frequently inundated with security questions or calls from your parents to fix their problems, or if you simply live on the other side of the country and you can't, you're not in the same town, you can't just hop over and fix the problem when you have some free time. So setting up a way for you to remotely access their computer so you can fix their problems essentially the same way as you would sitting in front of it is an option. Now, you want to make sure that you're not leaving remote access on all the time. You don't want somebody random to be getting into their computer, but you can set it up so that they can just enable the remote access with the click of a button. If you set up Apple Remote Access or Back to My Mac, something like that, just so they can essentially, you can give them instructions on here's how you turn it on when I tell you to turn it on. But at the same time, you want to remind them not to let other people take remote control of their computer, because there are many, many, many tech support companies out there, scam companies that try and take advantage of people this way. They say, hey, download this remote control software, install it, and we'll connect and we'll fix the problem and we'll charge you $200. And there wasn't any problem, and they just scare people into thinking there was a problem. And there's been a big crackdown on that stuff lately, but it's still, they're scammers. They crop up every day. So remind them that, you should be the only one who's actually remotely connecting to them. I've heard that Apple, in some cases, does remote access to computers in the course of Apple Care. I actually haven't experienced it myself, so I'm not positive on the truth of that. But for the most part, the major vendors don't actually do remote support like that. They want you to bring your computer to their store so they can take care of it there. So for the most part, just let your parents know that it's not normal that they'd want to be giving access to anybody else to their system besides you. But another thing to keep in mind, especially if you have parents who are, the first question that comes up in their mind, they immediately turn to you. Keep in mind that you might want to go by the teach a man to fish approach. If your parents start taking the time to learn about some of the security stuff, they'll be less reliant on you in the future to handle all of the tech support questions. Just don't overload them with information all at once. In my personal experience, my parents used to call me all the time with computer tech support questions, and it took a while, actually. It probably took a couple of years to kind of teach them the basics and get them going. But it's to the point now where they don't generally contact me with questions. They, sometimes in passing say, "Oh, hey, I figured this problem out all on my own," or "I did a Google search and figured it out," and they're doing just fine. So that might be another thing to keep in mind if you have some parents who are willing to learn and you're willing to take the time to teach them.
We've, of course, been covering a lot of security stuff for, well over a year on this show at this point. I don't know that I would necessarily say that you want to, we would love it if your parents gave the show a listen. But you might actually want to direct them to the page that we have for show notes as well, because if they come across a particular problem, having things written in front of them, it's not so much step-by-step instructions necessarily, but having things written in front of them where they might be able to read something and say, "Oh yeah, that's happened to me," or "Oh, I see, maybe I should have tried this," and then going off and doing that. Or at the very least, you've got a place that you can look back to and maybe print out a couple of things for them if you want to as well. The place to find our notes is securemac.com/checklist. That's for every episode we've done so far and all the episodes going forward. securemac.com/checklist. I'm also not going to encourage you to give your parents our email. I guess you can, but that's really just setting up Nick and Nick for a lot of work. Tell you what to do, though. If they eventually hit you up with something and you've listened to the shows and you've checked stuff out and you still have a question, then go ahead and send us an email. Checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. Really, that's a show-specific email, though, so if you've got an idea for a topic or maybe a question about something that we talked about in a past episode and you'd like a little more clarification, checklist@securemac.com is our email address. And if you can't remember that, do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.